Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting of Troy City Council. My name is William Lutz, President of Council. It's Monday, February 7th, 7 p.m. We will begin with the invocation and pledge of allegiance given by Mr. Phillips tonight. Please stand.
Bow your heads, please. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this season. Thank you for allowing us to gather here and look over the city's work that we have to do. I want to ask you for a special thank you for watching over all of our emergency services, folks that were working over the snowstorm and the great job that they did. And I'm so happy that everybody was safe and there were no major incidents. A little special shout out to our Bengals fans, and hopefully this coming Sunday you'll watch over our boys and bring us home to victory. In your name we pray, amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Moving on, can we have the roll call this evening, please, Mrs. Knight?
Mrs. Snee. Here. Mr. Whidden.
Here.
Mr. Twist.
Here.
Mr. Rozelle.
Here.
Mr. Pierce.
Here.
Mrs. Marshall. Here. Mr. Sievert.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Present.
Mr. Schilling.
Make a motion to excuse Mr. Schilling.
Second. It's been moved to excuse Mr. Schilling by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Rozelle.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling is excused.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of the minutes of the last meeting of Troy City Council?
Minutes was Council January 18, 2022. Mr. Sievert was elected as temporary president of Council Pro Tem to chair the meeting. Public hearing was held on ordinance number 02, 2022. A rezoning, no comments were made. Committee reports. Building and Utilities Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing bidding for polyphosphate for the water treatment plant. Community Partnerships Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing submitting an application for a target of opportunity grant related to renovations to the Buckeye House. Finance Committee recommended legislation be prepared to approve a loan to Allen Financial Group. Also recommended legislation be prepared to modify a loan to 107 West Main LLC, and recommended that a loan from be approved to Speakeasy Raymond LLC. Committee then recommended that a release of mortgage be approved for Deborah Newsom. Streets and Sidewalks Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing resolution of necessity 2022 sidewalk program. Resolution of necessity be approved for the sidewalk portion of the South Stanfield Road reconstruction project, and recommended legislation be prepared to bid for the West Main Street Corridor Improvement Project. Resolution number R2, 2022, bid for polyphosphate, first reading and adopted. Resolution R3, 22, advertise for bids for West Main Street Improvement Project Phase 1, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R4, 2022, resolution of necessity, Phase 14, sidewalk program, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R5, 2022, resolution of necessity for replacement or installation of sidewalks for South Stanfield Road reconstruction project was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R6, 2022, application for a target of opportunity grant related to Buckeye House, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R7, 2022, loan application for Allen Financial Group was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R8, 2022, regarding modifications to loan for 107 West Main LLC was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R9, 2022, loan for Speakeasy Raymond LLC was given first reading and was adopted. Ordinance number 073, 2021, subdivision regulations was given third reading and was adopted. Ordinance number 02, 2022, a rezoning, was given public hearing and second reading. Ordinance number 03, 2022, release mortgage lien Deborah Newsom was given first reading and adopted. A presentation was made by Shane Carter, Executive Director of the Lincoln Community Center, an update on the center. Following comments, council adjourned at 7:55 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to dispose of the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
It's been moved to approve the minutes by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Whitten.
Yes.
Approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We move into committee reports. We have a plethora of reports this evening. We'll begin with the Building Committee and Mrs. Marshall.
All right, on January 24th, this committee met to consider authorizing bidding for the Hobart Arena roof replacement project. The roof areas need to be replaced include the barrel roof, the roof over the compressor and boiler room, and the west side roof. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Recreation Board to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the Hobart Arena roof replacement project at a cost not to exceed $670,000. Respectfully submitted by Mr. Twist, Mr. Whitten, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Marshall. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we have two reports from the Community and Economic Development Committee, and standing in for Mr. Schilling is Mrs. Snee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Committee members Pierce and Snee met on January 24th to review the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission that parcel number D08099763, located on South Dorset Road at Arthur Drive, be rezoned from M2 to B1. This committee supports the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission regarding this proposed rezoning and recommends that council adopt ordinance number 02-2022. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, myself, and Mr. Schilling as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, Mrs. Snee, please continue.
Yes, committee members Pierce and Snee met January 24th to consider the petition filed for the annexation from Concord Township of 25.3483 acres located on State Route 718 and Peoples Road, known as the Mortel annexation. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to provide for the three legislative items required by state law related to the Mortel annexation. To meet the timeline of the state law for an expedited annexation, the committee supports emergency legislation. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, myself, and Mr. Schilling as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Parks and Recreation Committee and Mr. Whitten.
Thank you, Mr. President. On January 24th, committee members Rozell and Whitten met to consider authorizing bidding for two golf simulators for Miami Shores Golf Course. The simulators would be an added feature to Miami Shores used to attract golfers. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Board of Park Commissioners to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for two golf simulators for the Miami Shores Golf Course at a cost not to exceed $100,000. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Schilling, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Whitten. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, move on to the Streets and Sidewalks Committee with two reports this evening, and Mr. Phillips.
Scroll down here just a little bit further. This committee met on January 24 to consider appointments to the Assessment Equalization Board and set the meeting date and time of such board. The board would hear appeals filed related to the estimated assessments for the sidewalks and shared use path portion of the South Stanfield Road Reconstruction Project Phase 1. The AEB may only consider matters pursuant to the authority set forth in the ORC Chapter 727. It is the recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared, that the Assessment Equalization Board meet on February 23, 2022 at 6:30 p.m. at City Hall, and that the board members are Renee Gummerlock, Roberta Jacobs, and John Terwilliger. Based on the date the AEB will be meeting, we do support emergency legislation. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Mr. Phillips, you can continue.
Continuing on February 2nd, committee met regarding authorizing, excuse me, Authorizing a professional services agreement for construction administration services for the West Main Street Corridor Improvement Project. The amount of $850,000 was included in the 2022 budget for an agreement, and it is the recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into a professional services agreement with Prime Construction Management and Survey, Inc. for construction administration services for the West Main Street Corridor Improvement Project Phases 1 and 2 and the Duct Bank Project at a cost not to exceed $850,000. The committee also supports emergency legislation so that the agreement can be executed as bidding for elements of this project is already underway. And again, this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Are there any comments or questions on this report?
Mr. President?
Yes,
Do you
ma'am.
have a report from the Law and Ordinance?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
You're next.
All right, thank you.
Rounding things out is an oral report tonight from the Law and Ordinance Committee and Mrs. Snee.
Thank you. This committee met on February 2nd to consider a request for support of a Trex liquor permit application of Fermentum Enterprises LLC for a new business at 8 South Market Street for D1, D2, and D6 permit categories. This committee concurs that this Trex application would be an economic development project and recommends that a letter of support be submitted by the Director of Public Service and Safety for the D1, D2, and D6 Trex liquor permit application as requested by Fermentum Enterprises LLC for a business at 8 South Market Street. As this is not a matter of legislation, this committee asks that this recommendation to support the Trex application be accepted by council so that a letter can be provided to be included in the application that the applicant will submit to the Division of Liquor Control. And this report is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Do you wish to make a motion?
I do. Pursuant to that, I move that the recommendation of the Law and Ordinance Committee be approved and that the Director of Public Service and Safety submit a letter of support for the D1, D2, and D6 Trex liquor permit application as requested by Fermentum Enterprises LLC for a new business to be located at 8 South Market Street.
Second.
I'll second that.
It has been moved and seconded to approve the motion for the liquor permits by Mrs. Snee, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Motion is approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to citizens' comments for items on the agenda. We have 7 resolutions and 1 ordinance for discussion by council tonight. If you wish to address council on those items, you're invited to come to the podium, give your name and address, and you have 2 minutes to address council. Seeing nobody come forward, we'll move on to resolutions. We'll ask Mrs. Knight to please read the first resolution of the evening, Resolution R10 2022.
Resolution number R10, 2022, resolution authorizing the Recreation Board of the City of Troy, Ohio to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the Hobart Arena roof replacement project, cost not to exceed $670,000, first reading.
How's council wish to dispose of the item?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
The 3 reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution?
Resolution number R11, 2022. Resolution authorizing the Board of Park Commissioners of the City of Troy, Ohio to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for golf simulators for the Miami Shores Golf Course, cost not to exceed $100,000 for 2 simulators, first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution, Resolution R12, 2022?
Resolution number R12, 2022. Resolution appointing Assessment Equalization Board and declaring an emergency. This appoints the members of the board, Renee Gummerlock, Roberta Jacobs, John Terwilliger, and sets their meeting date in case there are appeals to the South Stanfield Road Reconstruction Phase 1 sidewalk portion. First reading.
Move to suspend.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
I've been ignored 4 times.
It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mrs. Snead, seconded by the vociferous Mr. Sievert. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R13, 2022?
Resolution number R13, 2022. Resolution establishing municipal services for certain territory containing 25.3483 acres more or less in Concord Township, proposed to be annexed to the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This would be one piece of legislation for the Mortel annexation, and this is regarding the statement of services. This is the first reading.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Sievert. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R14, 2022?
Resolution number R14, 2022. Resolution establishing buffer requirements for certain territory containing 25.3483 acres more or less in Concord Township, proposed to be annexed to the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is the buffering statement related to the Mortel annexation, first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R-15, 2022?
Resolution number R-15, 2022, resolution consenting to the annexation of certain territory containing 25.3483 acres, more or less, in Concord Township to the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is the third item of legislation for the Mortel annexation, first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last resolution of the evening, Resolution R-16, 2022?
Resolution number R-16, 2022, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement for professional services with Prime Construction Management and Survey, Inc. of Cincinnati, Ohio, for construction administration services for the West Main Street Corridor Improvement Project and declaring an emergency. This has a cost not to exceed $850,000, but it does cover the entirety of the West Main Street Improvement Project. First reading.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended, so we will adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to ordinances. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the only ordinance of the evening? Only Ordinance 02-2022.
Ordinance number 02-2022, an ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08099763 in lot 7392 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from M2 Light Industrial District to B1 Local Retail District. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission, and this would be the third reading.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. That concludes the legislative part of our agenda. We move on to communications and announcements. And Mrs. Knight, are there any?
Yes, it is time to start the annual reminders of filing of your financial disclosure statements. Please do so to avoid penalties.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to comments of officials. Mayor Odom.
I was afraid we might get into spring without having winter, but this last weekend took care of that. And just a shout out to our street crews. Well, it was more than our street, it was all of our departments, about 30 different employees who rotated for over 24 hours to get the streets clear. Just a big thank you to them.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple of comments. First of all, February 21st, Monday, is President's Day. So council meeting will be Tuesday night. Trash and recycling will be on schedule, no delays. We did suffer one delay, and that was recycling on Friday was postponed until Saturday. That was a last-minute overnight decision by Rumpke. I'm not aware that we received too many complaints, if any, about the shift, and we did try to get that out on social media as quickly as we could. Elaborating a little bit on what the mayor mentioned about the winter storm, the crews did do a fantastic job, I think. Probably a little self-serving of me to say that, but we did get our share of calls, comments, complaints, concerns, the 4 Cs. But we did get some, I'll go K on you, kudos as well. But I do want to mention that we did have a couple of streets. So Thursday morning, by the end of Thursday morning, we had salted all of the streets. Then we started plowing. We plowed during the day, into the night, went home late at night because there's a mandatory 8-hour rest by federal regulations that our crews had to take. And so then they started very early on Friday morning again. Worked all day Friday. Between Thursday afternoon and Friday all day. The crews did plow every street. When it came to the local streets, they were not necessarily curb to curb. In the manner of kind of the no kind deed goes unpunished category. Some of the earlier local streets, which again, this is a weekday, got a lot of people out working. You don't have a lot of traffic that's traveling on the local roads in the first place, but certainly not during the middle of the work week. So you didn't see a lot of breakdown. Some of the earlier streets that we plowed, we did one pass up and one pass down, and did not go curb to curb maybe as neatly as we did on some of the later streets. So in a couple of cases, there was a concern that maybe we missed those streets, but we did not. Since that time this morning, first thing, they did go out and they did clean those and clear those streets. And then we spent the day, a large part of the day, just kind of cleaning up, particularly intersections where it's slushed up over the weekend. And we'll continue to do that as well as work on the downtown as the weather warms up towards the middle of the week. But overall, I mean, this is our first and maybe only, knock on wood, major event of the season. And I think the guys and gals in the various public works departments did a very good job. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Titrington. Moving on to Director of Law, Mr. Kerber.
I have no comments this evening, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kerber. I would say that I thought the snowplow response was probably one of the better responses we've had in the last few years. It seemed like the crews were out almost continuously. I did have a question. I did notice there was one truck on a side street that wasn't a city truck that was plowing. Did we have contracts with other plowers, or was this just
We
a
did
good
not.
Samaritan?
We can probably talk off the record about
Okay.
who that might have been,
Okay.
since we discouraged that
All right.
for liability reasons.
I would
if
hope
nothing
so.
else.
Thank you. And, you know, this pains me to say it, but I do hope the Cincinnati Bengals do really well. And as an avid fan of the Arizona Cardinals, I do hope that they beat the treacherous Los Angeles Lambs Sunday evening. So, do any council members have any comments that they would like to add this evening? Mr. Phillips?
I have to add on to that because coming from California, everything from LA is evil, so it's a good thing. I concur.
Three quick questions. The traffic signal, Kings Chapel Drive, West Main Street. I've just gotten a couple questions lately. I think due to when it was warm and Magic Tunnel gets busy, people are asking now when that signal might be completed on Kings Chapel Drive and West Main Street.
It's in the ship off of LA, just waiting.
Waiting, we're still waiting for parts. All right.
Maybe the Bengals can bring it back with them.
Just the goalpost.
Just didn't know if there was an update.
No, only that it's part of the supply chain issue. We're hopeful in the next couple of months that we're going to get it.
Well, it seemed that when it got warm, everybody must have gone to Magic Tunnel, and then they were complaining they couldn't get out, but.
Sure.
Second question was, is there somewhere where citizens can see where we're replacing trees? Someone asked me, like, when we take a tree down, whether it's in the park or wherever, we replace those trees, but they were asking if there's any documentation of how we replace the trees, or how many, or what, do we have a tree planting
No,
process?
I know the park superintendent keeps track of that. It's not a cut and dry report, pardon the pun, because in some cases, like along tree lawns, a tree may be dead and we might pull it and the property owner doesn't want one. In other cases, maybe somebody didn't have one and they'd like one. As a tree city, we do try to replace at least 1-to-1, if not add, but it varies by property.
If they had specific questions, they can just call the park
Correct.
department. Okay. I didn't think we had anything. I was like, yeah, call the park department.
Okay.
All right, that's it.
Okay,
Bill, I have one question.
Mr. Seaver.
I have one question for Mr. Tiddington. What do you call 55 men gathered together to watch the Super Bowl? The Cleveland Browns.
It's hilarious.
Just in honor of your
Might still be
of your attention, yeah. What's Baker doing this week? He's going,
Todd
Working at
Seaver
concession
had
stand.
no comment.
Thank you, Mr. Seaver.
Baker, Roethlisberger, and Mahomes all going into a bar to watch the Bengals?
Do any other council members have, Mr. Whidden, please help us.
Thank you.
I didn't see it today, so I don't know if it happened, but that's just one last question on snow removal. I know that to expedite the process, the snow was, for the square, was kind of plowed into no man's land there, and the square, the triangles, thought it maybe might create a slight obstacle for vision. I don't know, is the plan to actually remove that at some point, or is that just kind of whether it's going to take care of it?
No, I mean, we try to clear all the piles as we can. We use the backloaders and the dump trucks, and then we just scoop it and take it typically out to the North Market Ball Fields
That was just
parking lot.
a time thing for the time being. It's gonna-
Yeah, they started doing some of the pushback today, and they'll continue to work through that as spots are open and vacant.
Okay. Any other comments or questions before we go to the order this evening? We have staff members in the audience. Do you have anything you wish to add? Now it's time for resident comments. If you wish to address council on any concern that your heart desires, please come forward, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume.
Good evening, Mr. President, members of council, Bradley Beringer, Crestwood Drive. Just a couple things. First of all, Mr. Sievert, got a question for you. Where's Patrick going to watch the Super Bowl from this year? From Mahomes. Saw that on Facebook, thought it was kind of cute. I'm just kind of disappointed that the DRO application that went through Planning Commission didn't come to council, because I think it should have been brought before council and discussed. There was a comment, there's been comments made that the council didn't have control of that, and that would have been the perfect time for council to weigh in on that whole mess. And I can't say too much about that because, of course, we all know where it is right now. But I think one thing that's come out of this, and one thing that could come out of this if our mayor chose to go this way, is that there needs to be some reform on our planning commission. I looked at the Ohio Revised Code today, and section 713.01 of the Ohio Revised Code says that the governing body may, by resolution, expand the planning commission to an even number of not more than 12 members. Now, 12 members, mind you, is a little unwieldy, I will grant you that. But Mayor, I would like to challenge you to consider adding at least 3 members to the planning commission from the historic preservation community. I think these people would understand more what our downtown is about. I'm not saying that our current planning commission members don't have that expertise, but I think we need to take this opportunity to bring some historic preservation-minded people to the table that don't have that avenue at the current time. Lastly, I'm just going to say this one last thing, and I'm going to piggyback this on Mr. Phillips. Hoo day, and I hope the Bengals bring the Lombardi home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Are there any other comments from citizens this evening? Seeing none, due to the President's Day holiday that was previously discussed, our next meeting will be on 2/22/2022. So please come, and it starts at 7 p.m. right here in council chambers. If there's nothing else, this meeting stands adjourned. Thank you for attending.